The smoke was still rising from the ashes of her home when Henrietta Leland realized she was the only one left breathing. It was the autumn of 1873, in the rugged, unforgiving territory of eastern Colorado, where the land stretched wide and golden beneath skies that seemed too beautiful to witness such ugliness. The Leland homestead had sat at the edge of a creek bed, a modest but proud collection of buildings, a farmhouse, a barn, a smokehouse, and a chicken coop, all of it built by hands that were now cold and still. Her father, Amos Leland, had spent 11 years turning that patch of hard earth into something that resembled a life. Her mother, Clara, had sewn curtains for every window. Her brother, 16-year-old Daniel, had just begun talking about his plans to raise horses of his own one day. And her husband, Robert Leland, a quiet, decent man she had married at 19, had been mending the fence along the north pasture when the raiders came out of the dust like something conjured by a nightmare. Henrietta had been inside, drawing water from the kitchen pump, when she heard the first shot. She was 23 years old, and in the span of 40 terrible minutes, everything she had ever known was taken from her. The raiders were a band of outlaws, not lawless drifters, but an organized and brutal gang who had been terrorizing the settlements along the Arkansas River corridor for 2 seasons running. They came for horses, for livestock, for whatever silver or cash could be found in a farmhouse drawer. They left behind silence and ruin. Sheriff's men out of Pueblo had been chasing their trail for months without catching so much as a hat brim. Henrietta survived because her neighbor's dog had barked that single wild sound, drawing her attention to the window, just in time to see the riders cresting the ridge, and she threw herself beneath the floorboards of the cellar without thinking, pulling the trapdoor shut above her and pressing herself flat against the cold earth while the world above her fell apart. She heard everything. Every shout, every crash, every terrible silence that followed. When she finally emerged, hours later, with dust in her hair and her hands shaking so badly she could barely lift the trapdoor, the sun was already touching the horizon. She walked out into the yard and she stood among the wreckage of her life, and she did not scream. She could not. There was nothing left inside her that knew how to make a sound. That was when she heard the horse. A single rider was coming up the road at a careful pace, not the reckless thunder of the raiders, but the measured, deliberate walk of a man who had already seen too much of the world to be in a hurry. He reined up at the edge of the yard and looked down at her from beneath the brim of a weathered brown hat, and she stared back at him, hollow-eyed and still. Timothy Mercer was 26 years old, broad through the shoulders, lean in the face, with dark eyes that held a steadiness she would come to understand later as something hard-won rather than simply given. He worked as a cattle drover and sometime deputy out of the town of Millbrook, 12 miles east, and he had been riding the long way back from a job further up the valley when he smelled the smoke and followed it. He took in the scene in a single sweep: the burned barn, the overturned wagon, the stillness that was not peaceful. And then he looked at her, standing in the middle of it all in her house dress with her arms wrapped around herself, and he swung down from his horse without a word. He did not say he was sorry. He did not say he could not believe it. He simply walked toward her, and when he reached her, he took off his coat and placed it around her shoulders and said, very quietly, "You are not alone right now. I am right here." She did not know why those words broke through when everything else had simply washed over her like noise, but they did. She felt the tears come then, hot and sudden, and she turned her face away from him because she was a proud woman who had never wept in front of a stranger in her life, and yet here she was. He let her cry. He stood nearby without crowding her, and he waited, and when she finally stopped and turned back to face him with her jaw set and her eyes red and fierce, he met her gaze without flinching. "My name is Timothy Mercer," he said. "I am going to go get help from Millbrook. But I am not leaving until you tell me whether you have somewhere safe to go." She thought about it. She had a cousin in Denver, a woman named Pauline she had not seen in 4 years. She thought about the road between here and there, about how far it was, about the fact that she had no horse because the raiders had taken every animal on the property. "I have nowhere to go tonight," she admitted, because she was not the kind of woman who pretended otherwise. He nodded as if this were a problem with a solution. "Then you are coming with me to Millbrook, and tomorrow we will figure out what comes next." She looked at him for a long moment. He was a stranger. In another life, in a safer time, she would have refused. She would have sent him on his way and managed on her own. But she looked at the ruined farmhouse behind her, at the twilight settling over the yard, and she understood with a terrible, clear-eyed practicality that she was not in a position to be proud tonight. She went with him. He rode and she sat behind him on his horse, a big roan mare named Clover, and neither of them spoke much on the road to Millbrook. The night air was cold and sharp with the smell of pine and dust, and Henrietta kept her eyes fixed on the dark horizon ahead of them, trying not to think about what she had left behind. She noticed that he rode with one hand on the reins and kept the other loose at his side, not a nervous man, not a careless one either, but someone who had learned to stay alert without letting alertness become fear. They arrived in Millbrook a little past 8 in the evening. It was a small town of perhaps 300 souls, with a main street of packed dirt and a row of timber-framed buildings. A general store, a saloon, a livery stable, a telegraph office, and a boarding house run by a widow named Mrs. Agnes Holt. Timothy brought Henrietta straight to the boarding house, knocked on the door, and spoke quietly to Mrs. Holt while Henrietta stood on the porch steps looking at the lit windows of the saloon across the street where she could hear men laughing. It seemed incomprehensible that men could laugh tonight. Mrs. Holt was a soft-spoken woman of about 50 with kind, practical eyes, and she took one look at Henrietta and asked no questions beyond which kind of tea she preferred. She gave her a room at the top of the stairs, a small, clean space with an iron bed and a patchwork quilt, and she brought up a basin of warm water and a clean nightgown, and left her to herself without ceremony. Henrietta sat on the edge of the bed for a long time without moving. She pressed her palms flat against her thighs and stared at the far wall and tried to think of what came next, because she was a woman who had always survived by thinking about what came next, and if she stopped doing that she was afraid of what would rush in to fill the space. There was a soft knock at the door. "Miss Leland," said Timothy's voice, "I have brought you some supper. Mrs. Holt said you have not eaten." She opened the door. He was standing in the hallway with a plate of bread and cold beef and a small jar of apple preserves, and she noticed that he had taken off his hat, which made him look younger somehow, more human. "Thank you," she said. "I sent a wire to the sheriff's office in Pueblo," he said. "They will send men out to your property at first light." She nodded. "I also took the liberty of writing down what I observed at the scene while it was fresh. For the report," he held out a folded piece of paper, "in case they ask you to describe the riders, if you remember anything you can add it." She took the paper. She looked at it. His handwriting was careful and deliberate, like a man who had taught himself to write without anyone's help and had never let himself get careless about it. "You are very organized for a drover," she said. Something moved at the corner of his mouth. Not quite a smile, but close to one. "I do a few things." She did not sleep that night, not really, but she lay on the bed and watched the ceiling and let the darkness hold her, and in the morning she got up and washed her face and braided her dark hair back from her face and went downstairs, because she was Henrietta Leland, and she did not allow herself to stay in bed when there was something to be done. Timothy was already at the breakfast table. He stood when she came in, which she noted, and he poured her a cup of coffee, which she appreciated, and then they sat across from each other at Mrs. Holt's small dining table, and the morning light came through the checked curtains and lay across the tablecloth between them. "I want to go back," she said. "Today I want to see what can be salvaged." He looked at her steadily. "The sheriff's men will be there. I know I still want to go." He did not argue. He did not tell her it was too soon or that she ought to stay here where it was safe. He simply said, "I will ride out with you." She looked at him. "You do not have to do that, Mr. Mercer. You have already done more than most men would." "I know I do not have to," he said simply. "I am choosing to." She could not find a reason to refuse, so she said nothing more, and after breakfast they rode out together. The daylight made the Leland homestead look worse, somehow, than the twilight had. The morning sun was merciless in the way it laid everything bare, every charred timber, every overturned piece of furniture, every small ordinary thing that now lay scattered across the yard. The sheriff's men, 2 deputies from Pueblo named Hawkins and Cole, were already moving through the property when Henrietta and Timothy arrived, cataloging and noting and doing the necessary professional work of documenting a catastrophe. Henrietta walked through the ruins of her house. She did not weep. She moved with a focused, deliberate calm that Timothy watched from a respectful distance, staying close enough that she knew he was there without hovering over her. She found her mother's sewing basket, singed but mostly intact, in the corner of what had been the front room. She found her father's Bible, its cover warped and swollen from smoke and water, but the pages still legible. She found nothing else worth carrying away. Deputy Hawkins approached her with his hat in his hands. He was a large, awkward man with a sunburned neck, and he delivered his condolences with the stiff, uncomfortable air of a person who had done this before but had not gotten better at it. "We believe it was the Aldrich gang, ma'am," he said, "responsible for at least 4 other raids along the river this year. We are actively pursuing them." "Actively pursuing," she repeated. Her voice was very controlled. "My family is dead, Deputy Hawkins. My husband is dead. Please tell me what active pursuit means in practical terms." Hawkins looked uncomfortable. "We have leads, ma'am, good ones. We expect to have men in custody before winter sets in." She nodded once, accepting this not because she believed it entirely, but because there was nothing else she could do with it right now. She looked out across the ruined yard, at the creek glinting in the distance beyond the fence line, at the hills rolling away to the south in their indifferent, beautiful way, and she felt something shift inside her. Not resolution exactly, but something harder and cleaner than grief. A kind of bedrock. Timothy came to stand beside her as the deputies moved away. They stood quietly looking at the property together, and after a while she said, "I cannot rebuild this alone." "No," he agreed, "and I will not stay in Millbrook indefinitely on Mrs. Holt's charity." "No," he said again. "I have a cousin in Denver, Pauline Cross. I have not seen her since before my marriage." She paused. "I have some money." Robert kept a tin buried under the floorboards in the bedroom. "The raiders did not find it. It is enough to get me to Denver." She had gone back for it this morning while the deputies were occupied elsewhere, lifting the board with her bare hands and pulling out the tin with its folded bills and small collection of coins. She had counted it precisely and put it in her coat pocket without expression. "Denver is not a short trip," Timothy said. "I know that." He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "The stage runs north from Millbrook on Thursdays. That is the day after tomorrow." She turned to look at him. The morning light was on his face, and she noticed for the first time, in that clear and unromantic way that grief sometimes brings with it, that he was a handsome man. Not in a showy way, but in the way of someone who had been outdoors a great deal and had good bones and did not fuss about his appearance. His dark eyes were looking at her with an expression she could not quite name. It was not pity, which she was grateful for, and it was not the careful professional distance of the deputies. It was something more personal than that, something more present. "You are trying to make sure I am taken care of," she said. "I am trying to be useful," he said. "There is a difference." She considered that. "Yes," she said, "there is." They rode back to Millbrook in the early afternoon, and over the following 2 days, a strange and quiet rhythm established itself between them. Timothy was around. He did not explain why he was not pushing further on toward wherever he had been going before this, and she did not ask, because she understood without being told that he had made a decision to stay until she was safely on the stage, and she found she was glad of it in a way she did not examine too closely. He accompanied her to the telegraph office where she wired Pauline in Denver. He waited outside the dress shop while Mrs. Holt took her in to find something practical and warm for the journey, because everything she owned had burned. He ate supper with her at Mrs. Holt's table each evening, and they talked, not about the raid, but about other things. About the country. About Denver, which he had visited twice. About his work as a drover, which he described in plain, unsentimental terms that nonetheless managed to convey a genuine affection for the life. About her father's farming, which she described with a specificity and technical knowledge that made him look at her with something that might have been admiration. She learned piece by piece, the way you learn a person when you have time and circumstance pressing you together, that Timothy Mercer had grown up in Missouri, the third of 5 children, and had come west at 17 with nothing but a horse and a willingness to work. He had no family left to speak of. His parents had died of fever some years back, and his brothers had scattered. He had been a ranch hand, a trail driver, a part-time deputy. He was not a restless man, she realized, just one who had not yet found the place where he wanted to stay. On the second evening, a Wednesday, they sat on the porch of the boarding house after supper while the night came down softly over the town, and the smell of wood smoke drifted in from somewhere down the street. She had her hands folded in her lap, and he was leaning forward with his elbows on his knees, and there was a comfortable easiness to the silence between them that surprised her. "Can I ask you something?" she said. "You can," he said. "Why did you stay? You could have brought me here and gone on. You did not owe me anything." He was quiet for a moment, not the quiet of a man avoiding a question, but the quiet of a man thinking about how to answer honestly. "When I came up that road and saw you standing there," he said finally, "I thought that is the most alone I have ever seen a person look, and I could not just ride past that." She sat with that for a moment. "That is a very honest answer," she said. "I try to be honest," he said. "It is easier to keep track of." She smiled then for the first time since the raid. It was a small, private smile that she turned away from him before he could see it fully, but he saw it anyway, and he felt something shift quietly inside himself that he did not quite have words for yet. The Thursday stage left Millbrook at 7 in the morning. Timothy was at the boarding house at 6, hat in hand, to see her off. Mrs. Holt had packed her a basket with bread and dried fruit, and a small jar of honey for the journey. Henrietta stood in the street with her few belongings tied in a cloth bundle, wearing a dark green coat that was new and not hers and still smelled faintly of the shop, and she looked at Timothy Mercer in the early light and felt something she was not ready to name. "Thank you," she said, "for everything you have done. You are a good man, Mr. Mercer. You are a strong woman, Miss Leland," he said. "I hope Denver is kind to you." The stage was loading. She picked up her bundle. And then she stopped because he was holding out a small folded piece of paper, and she took it before she fully decided to. "That is the address of the Millbrook post office," he said. "I check there when I pass through. If you ever need anything, or if you want to write, I would be glad to hear how you are getting on." She looked at the paper. Then she looked at him. "I will write," she said, and she got into the stage before she could say anything else, and she pressed her forehead briefly against the glass of the small window as the horses moved forward and watched him standing in the street with his hat in his hands until the road curved and she could not see him any more. Denver in the autumn of 1873 was a city pulling itself upward, booming with railroad money and cattle industry, full of noise and ambition, and the particular energy of a place that has decided it is important. Pauline Cross lived in a neat, modest house in a neighborhood east of the business district with her husband Edward, a quiet man who worked as a bookkeeper, and their 2 small children. Pauline was 2 years older than Henrietta, rounder and softer, and she wrapped Henrietta in her arms the moment she stepped off the stage and held her tight without saying a word, and that was the right thing to do. Henrietta stayed with the Crosses through October and into November, helping with the children, learning the shape of the city, trying to figure out what came next. She was not a woman who was built for uncertainty. She was a woman who was built for work and purpose, and the grief sat inside her like a stone, real and present, but she would not let it stop her from moving forward. She found work as a seamstress at a dress shop on Larimer Street, which paid modestly but reliably. She learned the streets of Denver. She attended church on Sundays with Pauline and felt the community of it even when the words did not fully reach her. She thought about Robert and her parents and Daniel, not constantly, but with a daily, faithful tenderness that she understood was what love looked like after it had lost its object. It did not disappear, it simply changed its form. And she wrote to Timothy Mercer. The first letter was practical, almost businesslike. She described her arrival in Denver, her cousin's house, the work she had found. She thanked him again for his kindness. She asked, almost as an afterthought, how he was. His reply came 3 weeks later, written in that careful, deliberate hand she recognized, on a single folded sheet of paper. He was fine. He had taken a winter job at a ranch south of Millbrook, tending stock through the cold months. He had heard from Deputy Hawkins that the sheriff's men had arrested 2 members of the Aldrich gang, though not Aldrich himself. He hoped she was well. He had thought about her. That last line, "I have thought about you," was simple and plainly stated, not embellished, and she read it 3 times. She wrote back sooner than she meant to. The letters continued through November and December, and into the new year of 1874. They grew longer, and then warmer, and then, by February, into something she could only describe as honest in a way she had not been honest with anyone in a very long time. She told him about the strange loneliness of grief, not the dramatic, acute agony of the first days, but the quiet, persistent ache of it, the way she would reach for something to tell Robert and find only silence where he used to be, and how she was learning to live in that silence without being swallowed by it. He told her about the ranch, about the long winter nights, about the particular beauty of snow on the Colorado plains that he had never quite been able to describe before, and found himself trying to describe for her. He told her that he had begun thinking seriously about taking on a piece of land of his own. He told her that he had been given the opportunity to become a full deputy in Millbrook come spring, if he wanted it. He told her he was not sure what he wanted, except that he was sure he wanted to see her again. She read that letter sitting at the small desk in her room at Pauline's house, with the winter rain tapping at the window, and she pressed the letter flat between her palms and sat very still for a long moment. Pauline knocked and opened the door. She had a knack for appearing at precisely the right moment. "Another letter from your drover?" she asked, in the mild, pleasant tone that was her way of asking much larger questions. "He is not my drover," Henrietta said. "Of course not," said Pauline, and went back to the kitchen. In March, Timothy wrote to say he would be passing through Denver on his way north to take a herd to a buyer in Cheyenne. He would be in the city for 2 days at the most. He hoped he was not being forward in mentioning it. Henrietta wrote back the same day she received the letter, which was something she had never done before. She told him he was not being forward. She told him she would like to see him. He arrived on a Tuesday afternoon in the middle of March, 1874, and she met him in front of the dress shop on Larimer Street, because she could not think of a more neutral place that was also not the inside of Pauline's house with Pauline hovering nearby. She stood on the boardwalk in her dark green coat, the same one she had bought in Millbrook, and watched him ride down the street, and recognized him immediately by the way he sat a horse, that particular careful, unhurried manner of his. He swung down and tied his horse to the rail, and when he came up the boardwalk steps and took off his hat, she saw that he looked well. Taller than she remembered, or perhaps the open street made that impression. He was looking at her with that same steady, present look she had remembered all through the winter, the one that made her feel seen without feeling exposed. "Miss Leland," he said. "Mr. Mercer," she said. They stood looking at each other for a moment, and then something lighter moved across his face, and she felt it move across hers too. Something that was almost amusement at the formality of it, given everything they had said to each other through the mail over the last 5 months. "It is very good to see you," he said, and the simplicity of it, the directness of it, undid whatever remaining formality she had been planning to maintain. "It is very good to see you too," she said. "Come, there is a decent restaurant around the corner. I have already told Mrs. Carmichael I will be an hour late this afternoon." He raised an eyebrow. "Planning ahead." "I always plan ahead, Mr. Mercer. I thought you would have gathered that by now." He laughed. She had not heard him laugh before, not really, and it was a warm sound, quiet and genuine, and she found that she wanted to hear it again. They ate lunch at a small, clean restaurant off the main street, and they talked the way two people talk when they have already said a great many things in letters and now must learn to say them in person, which is a different and more complicated task. The conversation moved from easy to careful and back to easy again, and she noticed that he listened to her in a way that was rare, with his full attention, and without waiting for his turn to speak, and she noticed that she listened to him the same way. He told her about the herd he was driving north, about the early spring thaw and what it meant for the trail conditions. She told him about the dress shop, about Denver, about a city council meeting she had attended with Pauline's husband Edward that had turned into a heated debate about water rights and road improvements. "You went to a city council meeting," he said. "I wanted to understand how the city works," she said. "Is that strange?" "No," he said, and he was looking at her in that way again. "Not strange at all." He walked her back to the dress shop afterward, and they stood again in front of it on the boardwalk, and the afternoon light was warm and the street was busy around them with the ordinary noise of the city. "I will be heading north day after tomorrow," he said. "I know," she said. "On my way back in 6 or 8 weeks I will be passing through again." She looked at him. The March wind was pulling a strand of hair loose from her braid, and she pushed it back and watched him watching her. "I would like to see you again," she said, because she was not a woman who pretended to feel things she did not feel or avoided saying things she meant. "I would like that too," he said. He came back in May, just as he had said he would, and this time he stayed 4 days, and they spent most of those days in each other's company, walking along Cherry Creek, eating supper with Pauline and Edward, sitting on the Cross family's front porch in the evening while the spring sky went through all its colors. It was on the 3rd evening, sitting on that porch in the blue dusk with the sound of the children already put to bed drifting through the open window above them, that he reached over and took her hand where it lay on the arm of the chair, and she let him, and they sat like that for a long time without speaking. "Henrietta," he said. He had started using her first name in his letters sometime in February, and she had not objected, but hearing it in his voice in the dim evening light was a different thing. "Timothy," she said, "I am not a man who says things he does not mean. I know that. So I want you to know that what I am feeling is real. I have been trying to be careful with it, because I know that the timing of all this is, I know you have been through something that I cannot fully understand. I know you lost Robert, and I would never ask you to set that aside or pretend it was not what it was." She turned her head to look at him. In the dimness she could see the lines of his face, serious and earnest. "I am not asking you to forget anything," he said. "I am only asking whether there is any room in your life as it is now for something new." She thought about the Leland homestead and the morning she had walked out of the cellar into the ruins. She thought about what she had built since then, out of the bones of that loss, the job, the letters, the slow, cautious work of reconstructing a self. She thought about Robert, who had been a good man and whom she had loved in the honest, practical way of two people building a life together, and she understood that she could carry him with her and still open a door. "There is room," she said. "I believe there is room." He lifted her hand and pressed his mouth briefly to her knuckles, and the gesture was old-fashioned and gentle and entirely sincere, and she felt it all the way through. He left Denver in May with the understanding that he was going to settle in Millbrook, take the deputy position he had been offered, and begin looking seriously at buying a piece of land. He would be back in Denver in late summer, and after that, well, they would see. They would see what came next. She returned to her letters and her work at the dress shop, But the world felt different now, as if someone had turned up the light a small degree. Pauline noticed. She did not say anything pointed, but she pressed a small jar of rose jam into Henrietta's hands one morning without explanation, and smiled in her mild, knowing way. The summer of 1874 passed in letters and in waiting, which was its own kind of tenderness, learning to want something and learning to be patient with that wanting, both at once. Timothy's letters from Millbrook were long and detailed now. He had taken a small room above the dry goods store, and he was deep in his work as deputy, which suited him in ways he described with obvious, understated pleasure. He was learning the town and its people. He had begun looking at a piece of land 3 miles east of town, 160 acres along a reliable creek, and he wrote to her about it with a carefulness that she understood meant more than just farmland. She wrote back and asked him plainly whether she was part of what he was imagining when he looked at that land. His reply was the longest letter he had ever written, and it left no uncertainty whatsoever about the answer. He came back to Denver in August. He came with his hat in his hands and his best shirt and a look on his face of complete seriousness that made her heart beat fast when she saw him on the porch of Pauline's house, because she knew, without any doubt, what was coming. He asked her to marry him in the Cross family's front parlor, with Pauline tactfully absent in the back of the house and the summer evening light gold and thick through the windows, and he asked her in his straightforward, honest way that left nothing ambiguous and promised nothing he could not deliver. And she loved him for that, for the plainness and the sincerity of it, for the way he asked and waited and did not assume. She said yes. They were married in October of 1874, a year almost to the day after the raid, in the small Methodist church in Millbrook. Pauline and Edward made the trip down from Denver with the children, and Mrs. Agnes Holt provided the reception dinner at the boarding house with a generosity that made Henrietta have to look away briefly and compose herself. It was a small wedding, a quiet one, but it felt right in the way that things feel right when they have been honestly earned. The land Timothy had been looking at, those 160 acres east of town along the creek, was theirs by November, the deed signed and recorded and solid in Henrietta's hands, which she held for a long time after the lawyer's office, reading the words that said her name on them. They built their house that winter and into the spring of 1875, not alone, but with the help of a community that had learned to value Timothy's steady, fair-handed work as deputy, and had extended that goodwill to his wife, who, it quickly became apparent, was not a woman who needed or wanted anyone's pity, but who could put in a day's work alongside anyone, and had opinions about construction that turned out to be correct. Neighbor men came to raise the walls and neighbor women came with food, and there was a warmth in it that Henrietta accepted carefully, like something precious that might break, because she had not expected the world to be capable of this, not after what she had survived. But she was learning. The house was modest and well built, 2 rooms down and a loft, with a kitchen that faced east to catch the morning light and a porch that faced west toward the long view of the plains. They planted a kitchen garden in the spring, and Timothy built a proper barn by June, and she chose curtain fabric from the general store, which she hung in every window because her mother had always hung curtains, and she understood now, with a depth she had not possessed at 23, what that meant. Life in Millbrook had its own particular texture, different from the isolated homestead of her girlhood, different from the noise of Denver. It was a small enough place that everyone knew everyone's business, which she had expected to dislike and found she did not mind so much when that business was conducted with basic human decency. The townsfolk were a mixture of the ordinary and the eccentric that she came to appreciate: the general store owner, a meticulous man named Hobart who kept his shelves in a state of obsessive order; the saloon keeper, a surprisingly soft-spoken widow named Della who ran the cleanest establishment in town; the school teacher, a young man from Ohio named Mr. Clark who was enthusiastic and idealistic, and sometimes asked Henrietta's opinion on practical matters with a flattering seriousness. She took on seamstress work part-time from the boarding house and the general store, because they could use the additional income while the farm was establishing itself, and because she was not built for sitting idle. She was good at it, better than she had known when she had done it in Denver, because now she was doing it on her own terms and in her own time. Timothy continued his deputy work alongside the farming, riding out when he was called for and coming home in the evening with that particular tiredness that comes from useful physical work honestly done. And she would have supper on the table, and he would wash at the basin on the porch and then sit across from her at the kitchen table, and they would talk about the day, every day. That ritual, simple and unremarkable, became one of the things she loved most about her life. She had not expected to be happy. She had not thought, standing in the ruins of the Leland homestead with the smoke still rising, that happiness was something still available to her. She had thought she would manage, would endure, would get through, because those were the things she knew how to do. She had not thought the world would open up like this and offer her something genuinely good. In the spring of 1876, Henrietta knew she was going to have a baby. She sat with the knowledge for 3 days before she told Timothy, not from any desire to keep it from him, but because she wanted to be sure, and because she wanted to feel the weight of it on her own first, to understand what she felt about it without anyone else's reaction influencing hers. What she felt, she discovered, was joy. Not uncomplicated joy, there was grief in it too, for the children she might have had with Robert, for the family she had lost, for the life that might have been. But mostly joy. A deep, cellular, irrefutable joy that surprised her with its force. She told Timothy on a Sunday morning in the kitchen, with the coffee on the stove and the early light coming through the east-facing window in its warm, daily way, and she watched his face as he understood what she was saying. He stood up from the table and came around to her, and he took both her hands in his, and she could feel that his were not entirely steady, which made her love him very much right at that moment. "Henrietta," he said, and his voice was rough with something that was trying to be more than his usual composure could quite contain. "I know," she said. He pulled her to him and held her, and she let herself be held, which was something she had learned to do, not perfectly, not without the old instinct toward self-sufficiency rising up sometimes, but generally with him she had learned to let herself be held. How are you feeling?" he asked. "Well," she said. "I feel well." "Good," he said, and held her tighter. The news traveled through Millbrook with the efficient speed that small-town news always does, and the response was warm and practical in the way that frontier communities tend to be. Food appeared on their porch. Advice was dispensed freely and was occasionally even useful, and Mrs. Holt declared herself available to assist with the birth when the time came, along with the town's physician, Dr. Warren, a steady-handed man from Pennsylvania who had been practicing in Millbrook for 3 years. The summer of 1876 was hot and dry, and Henrietta worked through it at her usual pace with certain modifications that Timothy suggested so diplomatically, she barely noticed him making them. A chair appeared beside her workbench. He quietly took over the heavier lifting without comment, and the night he saw her trying to carry a full bucket of water from the pump and appeared at her side to take it from her, was handled with such casual, unshowy concern that she only laughed at him a little. "I am not an invalid," she told him. "I know that. You are the least invalid person I have ever met, but that bucket is heavy and I am standing right here." "Fine," she said. "Take the bucket." "Thank you," he said, and he was smiling. They had planted a kitchen garden that had come in abundantly: squash, beans, tomatoes, herbs, and she put up preserves through August with a productivity that impressed even the established farm wives of the community. She was good at this, at the practical work of making a home from raw materials, at the 1,000 small tasks that turned a house into a life. She had been watching and participating in this work since childhood, and she brought to it not just skill, but a kind of reverence that she would not have been able to articulate, but that showed in the care with which she did each thing. They also had word, in late July of 1876, that the Aldrich gang leader, Emmett Aldrich himself, had been captured by a U.S. Marshal in New Mexico Territory and was to stand trial in Pueblo. Timothy told her gently, with a steadiness that she leaned on, and she sat with the news for an evening and then wrote a letter to the U.S. Attorney's office in Pueblo offering her testimony as a surviving witness of the Leland raid. She wrote it in her careful, precise hand and signed it Henrietta Mercer, and then she folded it and sealed it and handed it to Timothy to post, and then she went to bed. She did not go to the trial. By the time it was scheduled in October, she was in her 8th month and the journey was not practical, but her written testimony was entered into the record and Emmett Aldrich was convicted and sentenced to 20 years in the federal penitentiary, and Deputy Hawkins sent her a letter informing her of the outcome. She read it at the kitchen table with Timothy beside her, and she said nothing for a long time, and then she said, quietly, "Good." And that was all she needed to say about it. Their son was born in November of 1876, on a cold, clear morning when the first real snow of the season was coming down outside, and the kitchen was warm with the fire Timothy had stoked before riding for Dr. Warren. The birth was hard in the way that first births often are, but Dr. Warren was competent and calm, and Mrs. Holt was both of those things and also genuinely kind in a way that Henrietta had stopped being surprised by, because she had learned by now that kindness was not as rare as she had once feared. When it was over and she was lying in the clean linen with the small weight of her son against her chest, she looked at Timothy, who was sitting on the chair beside the bed with his elbows on his knees, and an expression on his face that she would remember for the rest of her life, that of a man looking at something he cannot quite believe is real and is afraid to disturb. "Come here," she said. He came and sat on the edge of the bed and looked at the baby, and she watched him look. "He looks like a person," he said. She laughed. It was a tired laugh, but a real one. "He is a person, Timothy." "A small one," he said, and there was a wonder in his voice that made her eyes sting. "Do you want to hold him?" He took the baby with careful, enormous hands, sitting very still as if he might break something, and he looked down at this small creature with an expression of complete seriousness, and the baby, who had been working himself up to protest, seemed to calm in his hands. "Hello," Timothy said to him, very quietly. "I am your father. I intend to take good care of you." Henrietta closed her eyes, and she carried her parents and her brother and Robert in her heart, and she held them there with love and with grief and with gratitude for having known them. And then she opened her eyes and looked at the world that was still going on, that was in fact sitting right here on the edge of her bed in the form of her husband holding her son, and she thought that she was, improbably, completely, and deservedly well. They named the baby Amos for her father. Timothy had suggested it himself without prompting, and when he did she had looked at him and felt the fullness of what it meant to have found a man who understood, without being told, what mattered. The boy was born healthy and strong, and loud about his opinions from the very first day, which amused Timothy enormously, and which Henrietta said came from his father's side, at which Timothy protested with dignity that he had never been loud a day in his life. They settled into the rhythms of a family, the particular beautiful chaos of a new baby in a small house, the broken sleep, the extraordinary ordinary moments of learning another person from scratch. Timothy was present in a way that she came to understand was not universal among men of his time. He woke in the night when Amos cried without being asked. He walked the baby in the cold kitchen at 2 in the morning while she slept. He changed the cloth diapers with an expression of determined practicality that she found irresistible. "You are very good at this," she told him one morning, watching him settle Amos into the small wooden cradle he had built himself in the weeks before the birth. "I am practicing," he said. "You do not have to practice. You already are good at it." He straightened up and looked at her. There was something in his face that was simple and clear and very private. "I want to be the best father I can be," he said. "That is all." She crossed the room and stood before him and took his face in her hands, which she did not do as often as she wanted to because she was still, in some small ways, learning not to hold herself back, and she said, "You are going to be magnificent. You already are." He covered her hands with his and they stood like that, and Amos slept in his cradle, and the morning light was gold through the east-facing kitchen window. By the spring of 1877, Millbrook had grown appreciably. Several new families had arrived, drawn by the land and the relative order that the sheriff's office had maintained. A second general store had opened across from Hobart's, which Hobart greeted with a competitive furor that was entirely disproportionate to the situation, and which kept the town entertained for months. A proper schoolhouse had been built, which delighted Mr. Clark and which Henrietta had been on the building committee for, because she had made herself useful to the town council, and the town had gotten used to consulting her. Timothy was promoted to senior deputy in the spring, which came with a modest increase in salary and a significant increase in responsibility. He handled it the way he handled most things, with unhurried competence and a basic human decency toward everyone he dealt with, whether they were the upstanding citizens of Millbrook or the occasional rough characters who drifted through and needed to be persuaded that the town had expectations. There was a day in May when he came home from a difficult afternoon, a dispute between two neighboring ranchers that had nearly become violent, and which he had resolved through a combination of legal authority and patient, direct conversation. And he sat down at the kitchen table with his hat still on and just looked at the ceiling for a moment. She set a cup of coffee in front of him and sat down across from him and waited. "Do you ever think about what might have been different?" he asked. "I mean, if you had not been at the homestead that day, if the raiders had come a day earlier or later." She looked at him. "I think about the day itself, not about what might have been different, because it was not different, it was what it was." He looked at her. "I lost my family," she said. "That is the true thing. And then I survived, and I built a new life, and I married you, and we have Amos, and this is also the true thing. I do not need to choose one truth over the other." He reached across the table and took her hand. "You are the strongest person I have ever known." "I am a person," she said simply. "Strength is not really the right word. It was more like I did not have a choice but to keep going, and then I discovered that I wanted to." "Because of what?" he asked. She looked at him steadily. "Because of you, among other things. Significantly because of you." He turned her hand over in his and traced the lines of her palm with his thumb, that small, private gesture of his, and she felt the warmth of it spreading all the way up her arm. "I was afraid to come up that road that evening," he said. "I could see something was very wrong, and I was afraid of what I would find. But you came anyway." "But I came anyway," he agreed. "That," she said, "is what I mean by strength." The summer of 1877 was gentler than the one before, with good rain in June and a lush, well-watered July that turned the land around Millbrook into something almost unrecognizably green. Their farm was producing reliably now. They had a small herd of cattle, a good kitchen garden, a pair of draft horses, and the chicken coop Henrietta had insisted on building in the first spring, because she was not a woman who could live without fresh eggs. Timothy's farming instincts were good, shaped by the practical knowledge of a man who had worked the land in various ways since youth, and they worked the place well together, each of them understanding the other's judgment without needing to argue about it. They also hired a young man named Caleb, 17, and recently arrived from Kansas with no family and a willingness to work that exceeded his experience. Timothy recognized something in him that he did not speak about directly, but Henrietta understood the particular look of a young man adrift, not from vice or laziness but from circumstance, who needed a steady hand extended. They gave him steady wages and a room in the barn's loft that they insulated properly against the winter, and he proved himself with such complete dedication that within a year he was indispensable, and within 2, he was something closer to family. Henrietta's work in the town had expanded beyond the seamstress role. She had, partly by accident and partly by the gravitational pull of her particular temperament, become involved in several community matters. She had helped organize the schoolbook drive when Mr. Clark ran out of primers. She had been on the committee that successfully petitioned for a proper road to be graded between Millbrook and the county seat. She had, with the quiet support of a few like-minded women of the community, started a small, informal lending library from a room at the back of the boarding house, using books donated by residents and a modest fund raised at a church supper. This last project she cared about most. She had been a reader since childhood, had always had a small stack of books on her bedside table, and the loss of her books in the raid had been a grief not insignificant among the greater griefs. She understood books as essential, not ornamental, and she wanted Millbrook to be a town where that understanding was shared. She got it up and running by October of 1877 with 43 volumes to its name, and she sat at the little desk on the first lending day and watched her neighbors come in and choose their books with an emotion she recognized as pride, uncomplicated and clean. Timothy came in that evening when she was closing up, and he stood in the doorway of the small room looking at the shelves. "Look at what you built," he said. 43 books, she said. "And the Millbrook Lending Library," he said. "Which did not exist until you decided it should." She straightened the last row of books on the shelf and turned to face him. The autumn evening was coming through the single window, gold and cool. "Someone had to," she said. "Someone always has to," he said. "You are usually that someone." She shook her head, but she was smiling. He reached up and took a book from the nearest shelf and looked at it. It was a volume of Tennyson, well worn from previous hands, and then he looked at her over the cover of it. "You have remade everything around you," he said quietly. "You know that, do not you? The house, the farm, this town. You have just remade all of it." "We have," she said. "You have," he said. "I have helped. You have done." She crossed the room and stood close to him, close enough that she had to tilt her face up to his, and she said, "Do not diminish yourself. I would not have any of this without you. I would still be standing in the ashes." "No," he said, "you would not. You would have found a way." "Maybe," she said, "but not this way, not this good." He set the Tennyson back on the shelf and put his arms around her, and she leaned into him, and they stood in the small, warm room with its 43 books while the evening settled outside. In the spring of 1878, Henrietta discovered she was pregnant again. This one she told him sooner. The evening of the day she was certain, after supper, sitting at the kitchen table with the lamp lit between them and Amos asleep upstairs in the loft. Timothy received the news with the same overwhelmed, contained joy as the first time, and then he said, "Are you well? How are you feeling?" "Perfectly well," she said. "A little tired in the mornings, otherwise fine." "Amos is going to be a terrible older brother," he said with a tone that meant entirely the opposite. She laughed. "He is going to be a wonderful older brother. He is already very generous with his belongings when he can be convinced they are not edible." "Fair point," Timothy said. This pregnancy was smoother than the first. She was healthier in it, more practiced in her own body's signals, more willing to rest when she needed to. The summer passed with a good harvest and several community events that she attended with her comfortable middle stage of pregnancy, and a complete lack of self-consciousness that her neighbors found characteristic of her. There was a town dance in July in the cleared space behind the general store, with fiddle music and the long summer evening staying light until 9 o'clock, and Timothy danced with her careful and slow, his hand warm on her waist, while their neighbors watched with affection, and she thought about the first evening she had ridden pillion behind him into Millbrook, hollow-eyed and shattered, and how very far she had traveled since then. "What are you thinking about?" he said, watching her face. "That evening I came to Millbrook with you," she said, "the first time." He looked at her for a moment. "That was a hard night." "It was the worst night of my life," she said simply, "and also in some strange way the beginning of everything I have now. I do not know quite what to do with that." "You do not have to do anything with it," he said. "You can just hold both things." "I know," she said. "You taught me that." He shook his head slightly. "You did," she insisted. "The morning at the homestead when the deputies were there. You did not try to tell me it was going to be fine. You did not try to take the feeling away. You just stayed there with it. With me, that taught me that both things could be real at once. He looked at her steadily, with that particular expression of his she had come to know as deeply felt. I did not know I was teaching anything, he said. The best teachers never do, she said. He pulled her slightly closer and they moved through the last bars of the slow fiddle tune, and she pressed her cheek briefly against his shoulder, and she felt the solid realness of him, this man who had come up a dark road toward smoke and found her standing in the wreckage and had not looked away. Their second child was born in October of 1878, a girl this time, and they named her Clara, for Henrietta's mother. She was a placid, cheerful baby with Timothy's dark eyes and Henrietta's stubborn, set to her chin, which became apparent early, and which Timothy said would be an advantage in life. And Henrietta said she hoped the girl would use it more diplomatically than her mother sometimes did. Amos, 2 years old now and deeply opinionated about his world, adapted to his sister with a mixture of possessiveness and bossiness that resolved itself, over the following weeks, into a genuine tenderness, and the sight of him sitting beside Clara's cradle and talking to her in his serious, not quite formed baby words was something Henrietta filed away in the part of herself that kept the things she most wanted to remember. The family settled into 4, Amos and Clara growing and changing with the speed that small children change, Timothy steady at his work and at her side, the farm expanding carefully as they could afford it, the town of Millbrook growing around them in its slow, organic way. The lending library acquired new books and Henrietta hired a part-time librarian, a quiet, intelligent young woman named Ruth Avery, who had been brought from Ohio by her parents and had clearly been hoping for more than a frontier town, but who, upon discovering the library, seemed to find her own reason to stay. By 1880, the Mercer farm had become one of the more stable and respected properties in the area. Nothing grand, nothing that made anyone rich overnight, but solid and growing, with a reputation for good stock and honest dealing that made Timothy's name and Henrietta's one of those paired names that communities adopt as shorthand for a certain kind of trustworthiness. Caleb, their hired hand, had by now become so integral to the place that he sometimes forgot he was not family and had to be reminded, gently, that he was welcome for as long as he chose to stay, which he took as invitation to continue indefinitely, which was exactly what Henrietta had intended when she said it. The Aldrich gang was fully broken up by 1880. Emmett Aldrich sat in the federal penitentiary, his lieutenants similarly housed or dead, the raiding along the Arkansas River corridor a thing of history. The territory was changing, railroads pushing further, more settlers arriving, the open range gradually being parceled and fenced. The wild, lawless quality of the landscape that had made the raid on the Leland homestead possible was not entirely gone, but it was diminishing, year by year, as the structures of civilization arrived and embedded themselves in the land. Henrietta thought about this sometimes, about the injustice of it, the way that violence had been visited upon ordinary, hard-working people who had done nothing wrong, by men whose lawlessness had been enabled by the absence of adequate law, by the distances that insulated outlaws from consequence, by the systems that left settlers on the frontier inadequately protected. She thought about her mother and father and Daniel and Robert, who had deserved longer lives and had not been given them. She carried that knowledge, that anger, that grief, and she did not let it curdle into bitterness, but she did not pretend it away either. She wrote a piece for the Millbrook Gazette. The town had acquired a small newspaper by 1879 about the need for stronger territorial law enforcement and better communication between settlement communities and the sheriff's offices. It was a practical, specific piece, not an emotional one, though the emotion behind it was plain enough to anyone who knew her story. The editor ran it, and it was reprinted in 2 other territorial papers, and a year later, the county significantly expanded its deputy sheriff coverage. Timothy read the piece the morning it was published and then looked across the table at her without speaking for a long moment. "I had things I wanted to say," she told him. "I might as well say them usefully." "You always do," he said. She raised an eyebrow. "Is that a criticism?" "Absolutely not," he said. "It is my favorite thing about you, one of them." "What are the others?" she asked. He considered this with the seriousness he brought to everything. "The way you plan ahead, the way you hold your coffee cup in both hands on cold mornings, the way you talk to Amos like he is a full person even when he is being unreasonable about his boots. The curtains." She blinked. "The curtains. You hang curtains in every room," he said. "Every time we have added a room or a window, you have hung curtains. I think about what that means to you, and it means something very important to me." She felt the warmth of that go through her. She had told him years ago about her mother's curtains, and he had not forgotten, and he had understood, and here he was on an ordinary Wednesday morning in 1880 telling her that he thought about it. That was the thing about Timothy Mercer. He paid attention. He had always paid attention from the very first evening, and he had never stopped. She got up from her chair and crossed the kitchen and stood behind him and put her arms around his shoulders, and he reached up and put his hands over hers. "I love you," she said. She did not say it as often as she felt it because she was who she was, but she tried to say it when it mattered, and it always mattered. "I love you," he said. "Very much. Every day." Amos appeared at the top of the loft stairs in his nightshirt, still sleepy but already looking for the day's action, and Clara came behind him with her determined toddler's walk, and the ordinary beautiful chaos of the morning recommenced. In the spring of 1882, they added a proper second story to the house, 2 full bedrooms above the main floor, with proper windows and a staircase that replaced the steep loft ladder Amos had been managing with increasing confidence and to his mother's ongoing anxiety. The construction was a neighborhood event, with men coming from the surrounding farms for the framing days, and Henrietta kept a kitchen full of food and oversaw the project with the same organized focus she brought to everything. When it was done and the stairs were in and the rooms were plastered, and the windows hung with curtains, of course, new ones she had sewn herself from a pale blue fabric she had ordered from Denver. She stood at the top of the stairs and looked at the 2 rooms, and she thought about the house that had burned and the one that had been built in its ashes, not on the same ground but from the same spirit, and she felt the full circle of that, not with sadness but with something that was almost completion. Timothy found her there. He came up the stairs and stood beside her in the doorway of Amos's new room, and she leaned against him without looking up. "It is a good house," he said. "It is a very good house," she said. "I keep thinking about building a proper root cellar before winter," he said. She turned to look at him. He met her gaze. They both understood what the word cellar carried in its history, and he had chosen it deliberately not to wound, but because that was who he was, a man who believed in saying the things that needed to be said. "A proper one," she agreed, "with a good latch on the inside." He nodded. "And enough space for all the preserves you are planning to put up this summer." "And I am planning quite a few," she said. "I know," he said, and there was a tenderness in it. By the following year, 1883, Amos was 6 and attending Mr. Clark's school with a ferocious enthusiasm for arithmetic and a more complicated relationship with reading. And Clara was 4 and already conducting elaborate conversations with anyone who would sit still long enough. And the farm was running so smoothly that Timothy had begun talking about reducing his deputy hours and putting more time into the land, which Henrietta encouraged because she could see that the land was where his heart was most fully at peace. And then in the late summer of 1883, she knew she was pregnant a 3rd time. She was 33 now, which was not old, but it was older than she had been with the first 2, and she held this pregnancy with a different kind of care, not fear exactly, but a richer understanding of what was at stake, a deeper appreciation of what was being made. Dr. Warren examined her and said she was in excellent health and he saw no reason for concern, and she took that at its practical face value. She told Timothy on a Sunday evening when the children were in bed, and the house was quiet, and the September air through the open kitchen window was starting to carry the first suggestions of autumn. She told him directly as she told him everything, and watched his face do what it always did, that overwhelmed, contained joy that he never quite managed to fully contain. "The third," he said. "The third," she confirmed. He was quiet for a moment. "Are you happy about it?" She looked at him. "Are you?" "Very much," he said. "But I am asking about you." "Very much," she said. He smiled, and it was the full smile, the one he did not deploy carelessly, the one that changed the whole landscape of his face, and she felt it the way she always felt it, like sun coming through clouds. This baby was born in March of 1884, a second boy, and they named him Robert, which she had decided quietly and announced to Timothy in the way she sometimes made decisions, having already made them, presenting them not as a question but as an established thing she was informing him of. He looked at her for a moment with a complexity of expression she could read perfectly by now, and then he said, "That is a good name," and that was all that needed to be said about it. Robert Mercer was born on a cold, bright morning, delivered with the competent assistance of Dr. Warren and Mrs. Holt, who at this point had been present for all 3 Mercer births, and had developed a possessive affection toward the family that she expressed by leaving casseroles on their doorstep unannounced for the first month after each birth. The house was full, and noisy and alive, and Henrietta moved through it with the particular grace of a woman fully inhabiting her life. Not the accidental grace of someone who has always had things easy, but the chosen grace of someone who has survived the unsurvivable and come through the other side, and decided, with full deliberation, what kind of person to be. Amos, who was 6, received his new brother with the diplomatic reserve of a person who has already been through this, and knows that his position in the household will eventually stabilize. Clara, who was 4, attempted to pick the baby up approximately 17 times in the first week, and had to be redirected each time with a patience that was divided equally between her parents. Caleb, now a confident and capable young man of 23, went about his work with the extra reliability of someone who understands that the household has increased in complexity and is adjusting accordingly. In 1885, Timothy was offered the position of county sheriff, which came with a significant increase in responsibility and also with a need to relocate slightly. The county seat was a town called Harrow, 18 miles west, which was larger than Millbrook and growing fast. He brought the offer to Henrietta the evening he received it, laid it out fully, described the work and what it would mean, and then sat back and waited, because that was how they did things together. She thought about it carefully and asked him questions, practical, specific ones about the housing situation in Harrow, about what it would mean for the farm, about the nature of the work and what he would be managing. He answered everything honestly. "Do you want it?" she asked finally. "I think I am the right person for it," he said. "Whether I want it depends on what you think." "Timothy," she said, "what do you think? This is your work, your life as much as mine." He looked at her. "I want it if you are willing to go." "Then go," she said. "We will take the house apart and put it back together in Harrow, and Caleb will come with us because I am not losing Caleb, and the children will have a larger town, and I will find what I need to find there. I always do." He looked at her for a long, quiet moment. "Do you know," he said, "that I have never once doubted the decision I made to ride up that road?" "I know," she said. "Every day I am grateful for it." "So am I," she said. "Every single day." The move to Harrow happened in the spring of 1885. They sold the Millbrook property at a fair price to a young farming couple named the Hendersons who had just arrived from Kentucky, and Henrietta supervised the packing with her characteristic thoroughness and the children's excited and occasionally unhelpful participation. Caleb drove the wagon. Timothy rode alongside. Harrow was larger than Millbrook, perhaps 800 people, A proper main street with a hotel and 3 saloons and a bank and a post office, a courthouse, and a schoolhouse that was twice the size of the one in Millbrook. It had the energy of a town that was becoming something, and Henrietta took that energy and turned it toward herself with the same focus she had always brought to new situations. The house they moved into was already built, a proper, solid structure that a previous resident had abandoned when the railroad rerouted, with 5 rooms and a wide front porch and a yard that needed work. She hung curtains in every window within the first week, and Caleb built a kitchen garden frame in the back, and Timothy's office at the courthouse was across the square from their front porch, so she could see the light in his window in the evenings, which gave her a daily reassurance she did not admit to anyone. She established herself in Harrow with the practical efficiency she always applied to a new community. She found the lending library, they had one, a modest collection housed in the courthouse annex, and she joined its committee and within a year was running its expansion. She found the school and spoke with the teachers about the children's needs. She found the women in town who were doing the ongoing, unglamorous, essential work of holding a frontier community together from the inside, and she made herself useful to them and let them be useful to her. There was a woman in Harrow named Grace Lawson who ran the County Charitable Aid Society and who became Henrietta's closest friend in the new town. A sharp-minded, sharp-tongued woman 10 years older than Henrietta, who had been a school teacher in Illinois and had come west with an abusive husband who had died of his own vices 2 years after their arrival, which Grace discussed with a frankness that Henrietta found refreshing. They suited each other, and Grace loved the Mercer children with an aunt's possessiveness, and Timothy liked her enormously because she was honest and direct and could be trusted to tell him the truth. It was Grace who told Henrietta, one afternoon in 1886 while they were sorting donated books for the library expansion, that half the women in Harrow had decided Henrietta Mercer was the most formidable person in the county. "Only half," Henrietta said. "The other half are afraid of you," Grace said. "That seems inefficient," Henrietta said. "I am perfectly approachable." "You absolutely are not," Grace said fondly. "You are excellent and terrifying, both." "Timothy does not find me terrifying," Henrietta said. "Timothy," Grace said, "adores you, which either demonstrates great bravery or great understanding, probably both." Henrietta smiled at her shelf of books. "Both," she agreed. The children grew. Amos became a 10-year-old who was already talking about law, which both of his parents observed with private amusement and public encouragement. Clara, at 8, was reading everything she could get hold of with a voracity that delighted her mother, and that suggested a direction, even if the direction itself was not yet clear. Robert, at 2, was compact and quick and determinedly physical in the way of youngest children who have observed older siblings long enough to know exactly how things are done. Timothy served as county sheriff with the same unhurried, principled competence he brought to everything. He was respected and occasionally tested by people who needed to discover his limits, and they discovered that his limits were firm, established without drama, and enforced with a basic fairness that was harder to argue with than anger would have been. The county was safer during his tenure, which was not a coincidence. Henrietta turned 40 in 1890, which she marked by hosting a supper for the women of the library committee, because she had decided years ago that she would spend her important days doing things she considered important. She was 40 and she was strong and she was happy, and she knew both of those things from the inside where they were most real. Timothy gave her a gift privately, before the supper, a small volume of poetry she had mentioned once, offhandedly, as a book she had loved as a young woman before everything burned. He had written to a bookseller in Denver and tracked down a copy which was not new but was clean and well kept, and he had written on the inside cover in his careful, deliberate hand, "For Henrietta, who made everything new, with all my love, Timothy." She held the book for a long time without speaking. "You remembered," she said finally. "I remember everything you tell me," he said. "Everything." She looked at him across the kitchen table. This man who had come up a road toward smoke on an autumn evening 17 years ago and gotten off his horse and walked toward her and stayed. The lines were deeper in his face now, the dark hair beginning to silver at the temples, but the eyes were exactly the same, steady and present and honest. "I love you," she said. "I love you," he said. They had built something from the ashes of everything she had lost, not a replacement for what was gone, because nothing could replace it, but something real and good and full in its own right. She carried her parents and her brother and Robert in the way she always had, with tenderness and grief and gratitude, and she lived her life forward into everything that had come from the ruins. By 1892, Amos was 15 and already apprenticing part-time at the law office of a man named Baxter in Harrow, running errands and reading law books with the dedication of someone who has found his purpose early and is not going to let it out of his sight. Clara was 13 and had decided, with characteristic decisiveness, that she wanted to be a teacher, and was already helping the younger children with their lessons at school in a way that Mr. Clark's successor, a sensible woman named Mrs. Fairfield, encouraged and made official. Robert was 8 and still the most physically energetic of the three, and had recently developed a passion for horses that Timothy quietly encouraged by spending Saturday mornings with him at the livery stable, teaching him to care for and handle stock. Caleb, now 31, had married a woman named Nell, a cook from the hotel, and they had built their own small place on the edge of town, but he continued working for the Mercers part-time because, as he said, some things were not about money, and the Mercers were family. The spring of 1893 brought a letter from Pauline Cross in Denver. Pauline's husband Edward had died the previous winter of a heart ailment, and Pauline, now 50 and alone with her grown children scattered to their own lives, was thinking about coming to Harrow. Would they have her? Henrietta read the letter at the breakfast table and then looked up at Timothy. "Yes," he said before she asked. "I have not asked you yet," she said. "Your cousin is alone and she is asking to come. The answer is yes." She looked at him. "We do not have a room," she said. "We would need to add one. Caleb and I can do that before summer," he said. "Timothy," she said. "Henrietta," he said very simply. "She was there when you needed someone. The answer is yes." Pauline Cross arrived in Harrow in June of 1893, rounder and grayer and with her same mild, knowing manner intact, and she settled into the new room at the back of the Mercer house with an ease that suggested she had been coming home rather than arriving somewhere new. She was wonderful with the children, particularly with Clara, whose plans to be a teacher she encouraged with a seriousness that Clara found entirely satisfactory, and she kept Henrietta company in the long evenings with the particular comfort of someone who has known you before you were who you currently are. It was Pauline who, sitting on the front porch with Henrietta one evening in that first autumn, said quietly, "You have done very well, Henrietta." Henrietta looked at the yard, at the kitchen garden still holding its late tomatoes, at Robert's horse paintings chalked on the fence post, at the lamp already lit in Timothy's office window across the square, waiting for him to come home. "I have," she said. "We have." "He is a good man," Pauline said. "He is the best man I have ever known," Henrietta said, without hesitation, and meant it entirely. Pauline made a small sound of satisfaction and picked up her knitting, and Henrietta watched the light in the courthouse window, and after a while Timothy came across the square in the early dark, a tall, broad-shouldered man with silver at his temples, and she watched him all the way across the square and up the porch steps, and when he reached her he put his hand on her shoulder and she reached up and covered it with hers. "How was the day?" she asked. "Good," he said. "Yours?" "Good," she said. He sat down in the chair beside her and they sat together in the September evening, the three of them on the porch, and from inside the house came the sound of the children's voices, Amos and Clara in some kind of argument that had the particular cadence of siblings who fundamentally like each other, and Robert's clear, bright laugh rising above it. and it was the most ordinary sound in the world, and the most extraordinary. In 1895, Amos was 18 and had begun proper law studies, writing letters to a law school in Denver that were so carefully reasoned and precisely argued that the school admitted him on the strength of them, which was not nothing, and which made his parents proud in the particular way you are proud when a child exceeds your hopes for them without exceeding their own. He left for Denver in September with his mother's dried beef and his father's careful, private advice, and the house felt different with him gone, bigger and quieter, the way houses do when a child who has been a center of gravity moves out of the orbit. Clara was 16 and had begun her practice teaching under Mrs. Fairfield's supervision with a calm, focused competence that her mother recognized, and Robert was 11 and had grown from physical to horse-mad, spending every available hour with horses in the way of someone who has found their vocation young. Henrietta was 45 and her dark hair had more silver in it than she had noticed, and she found it one morning looking in the mirror, and she stood for a moment observing this, and then she put up her braid and went downstairs and made the coffee and stood at the east-facing kitchen window watching the morning come up over the houses of Harrow, and she thought about her life. She thought about the cellar and the smoke and the silence. She thought about the road to Millbrook in the dark on the back of Timothy's roan mare. She thought about Mrs. Holt's boarding house and the breakfast table and the morning light on the tablecloth and a man who poured her coffee and stood up when she came into the room. She thought about the letters, all those letters, and the porch in Denver and his hand on hers in the dusk. She thought about the Millbrook house and the curtains and the lending library and the farm in Caleb and all of it, all the years of it, all the work and love of it. She thought about her mother, who had sewn curtains for every window. She thought about her father, who had built 11 years of a life and was proud of it. She thought about Daniel, who had wanted horses of his own. She thought about Robert Leland, who had been mending the fence when they came, who had been a good, quiet, decent man. She held them all. She always would. And then she heard Timothy's boots on the stairs, and she turned toward the sound. He came into the kitchen in his shirt and braces, not yet in his deputy coat, and he went to the coffee without looking up, and then he looked up and saw her face and stopped. "What?" he said. "Nothing," she said. "I am just looking at you." He set down his coffee cup and looked at her properly. 21 years of marriage had not made him any less careful about the way he looked at her. He had always seen her from the very first evening, and he still did. "Are you all right?" he asked. "I am perfectly, entirely, completely all right," she said. "I am just thinking about how much I love you." He came across the kitchen and stood before her, and he took her face in his big, work-rough hands, and he looked at her the way he had always looked at her, with that complete steadiness, that total presence. "I love you, Henrietta," he said. "Every day of my life I am glad you walked out of that cellar." She put her hands over his. "Every day of my life I am glad you came up that road," she said. He kissed her, gentle and sure, and the morning light came through the east-facing kitchen window and lay warm across them both. And outside in Harrow the day was beginning, and their children were alive in the world, and the life they had built stood solid around them, and it was enough, it was more than enough, it was everything. She had survived the raid that killed everything she loved. She had stood in the ashes and she had gone on, one deliberate step at a time, and she had built and been built in return. And here she was at 45 in a kitchen with curtains on every window, in love with a man who paid attention, who had come up a dark road toward smoke on an autumn evening in 1873 and gotten off his horse and said, "You are not alone right now, I am right here." She had not been alone since, and she never would be again. The autumn of 1896 brought Amos home from Denver for a visit, taller and more confident, speaking the language of legal argument with a fluency that delighted his father and amused his mother. And with him came a young woman named Helen, whom he introduced with a careful formality that told Henrietta everything she needed to know before any formal announcement was made. Helen was a quiet, thoughtful woman who sat at the Mercer table for supper that first evening, and listened more than she spoke and asked two precise, excellent questions that demonstrated she had understood everything being discussed. And Henrietta caught Timothy's eye across the table and he caught hers, and they said nothing, but they said it perfectly. Amos announced his engagement to Helen at Sunday dinner, and the family received it with the warmth it deserved. And Pauline cried a small practical quantity of happy tears, and then insisted on passing the bread rolls. The wedding was planned for the following spring, and Henrietta began making the plans with the thorough, organized pleasure of a woman who is good at this kind of work and knows it. By Christmas of 1896, the house in Harrow was full. Amos and Helen had come for the holiday, and Clara was home from her posting as a teaching assistant at the county school 15 miles north, where she was already doing the work of a full teacher. And Robert was 14, and filling doorways in the way of boys who have shot up suddenly, and have not yet fully inhabited their new dimensions. Caleb and Nell came for Christmas dinner with their two small children, and Pauline was at the table, and Grace Lawson brought her spectacular dried apple pie as she always did, and the table was extended with a board Timothy laid across two sawhorses and covered with the good tablecloth, and there were too many people, and not quite enough chairs, and it was exactly right. Timothy stood at the head of the table before the meal and looked around at all of them, his wife, his children, his friends, his extended and improbable family assembled from pieces the world had scattered, and he was not a man who made speeches, so he simply said, "I am grateful," and sat down, and everyone understood everything he meant. Henrietta looked at him. He was 49 years old, and his hair was well and truly silver now, and the lines of his face told the story of a life honestly lived, and he was the most beautiful thing she had ever seen, not despite those lines but because of them. She lifted her glass. "To everyone at this table," she said, "and to everyone who should be here and is not. We hold them both." "We hold them both," said Timothy, and everyone at the table said it after him because it was true, and because that was what the Mercer family did. They held everything, the grief and the joy, the loss and the living, the ashes and the curtains on every window, all of it together. The spring of 1897 brought Amos's wedding, which was held in the Harrow Methodist Church on a May afternoon when the apple trees outside were doing their best work. Henrietta wore a new dress she had sewn herself from a deep blue fabric that Timothy said suited her admirably, and she stood beside him in the front pew and watched their firstborn son marry a woman who was clearly his equal and his complement, and she held Timothy's hand the whole time. Afterward, at the reception supper in the courthouse hall, Timothy asked her to dance, and she said yes, and they moved together through the familiar slow steps of a waltz while the fiddle played and their children and friends moved around them. And she pressed her cheek against his shoulder the way she had at the town dance 23 years ago in Millbrook, that summer night when she had just begun to understand that she was going to fall in love with him, and he rested his chin briefly against her hair. And they were home. They were always home, because home was not the Leland farmhouse on the creek bed, though she loved it still in memory. Home was not the boarding house in Millbrook, though Mrs. Holt had been kindness itself. Home was not the farm east of town or the house in Harrow with its 5 rooms and wide porch. Home was this man, this particular steady warmth of him, this life they had chosen together from the ruins of a harder one. She had survived the raid. She had walked out of the smoke into a dark road and a man on a horse who had gotten down without being asked and stood beside her, and from that night forward she had never stood in anything alone. That was the story. That was the whole of it, and it was very, very good.